This may surprise you. My go-to drink when I am at an average bar with an average booze selection, or say at a wedding, is actually a gin and tonic. So let's talk about gin today. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Robin from This Blog's Neat, and this video is going to give you the rundown of everything you need to know about gin. Now, the distinguishing thing about gin is that juniper is the primary flavor. It's essentially a juniper spirit. That's pretty much it. That's pretty much what makes gin is the juniper. And juniper has this piney, resinous flavor. Not everyone loves it, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try gin if you don't love the piney, resinous flavor of juniper, because there are all these other botanicals that various distillers will blend into their gins to bring forward a lot of other flavors. These botanicals could be anything like herbs, peels, spices, etc. There's no limit to how many botanicals a distiller can add into their gin. They can choose to use just juniper, or they can use 47 different botanicals like Monkey 47 does. For reference, Tanqueray only uses 4 botanicals. Gin was actually originally a Dutch spirit and is still the national drink of Holland. Now, the Dutch version of gin is known as Jenever. I've also heard it pronounced other ways with a silent J, and it's spelled with both a G and a J, and it's a little bit confusing, so I will refer to it moving forward as Holland's gin. Now, the Holland style gin is said to be essentially like a whiskey and a gin had a baby. It tends to be pretty heavy on the grains, so the spirit is grain-based, and then that is distilled with juniper and other botanicals to bring forward the gin flavors, but it does still retain that grainy quality to it. And there's a variety of styles of Holland's gin. So it's said that Holland's gin came about in the 1600s because juniper was used to cure a variety of ailments, and then moved to England in the 1700s, and the pronunciation of Genever, however it's properly pronounced, was shortened to gin. I feel like I'm Ron Burgundy.
I believe it's jogging or yogging. It might be a soft J.
In the 1700s in England, there was a huge gin craze where everyone was making gin. Eventually, there were some regulations and taxes imposed on gin production, and that led to a lot of illicit gin distilling. This is where the style Old Tom gin came about, and the way it gets its name has a variety of different stories. One of those stories being that the distillers who were illegally making and selling gin would put a plaque of a tomcat outside of their distillery. There was a password, I think, and supposedly you could feed the cat money and gin would come out of a spout hidden by its paw. Now, the Old Tom style of gin was not what we know it to be today. Back then, there was a lot of flavoring and sweetener added to mask the crudeness. Remember, this style of gin was being illicitly distilled, so there wasn't that nice refinement that we have today. In the 1930s is when this more refined style of gin came about because the coffee still was invented. So distillers were able to have a cleaner spirit coming off their still, more refined, and they didn't have to mask all those harsh flavors with a bunch of additives. This is when the London Dry style of gin came about. Now, in the 1930s, gin was pretty much replaced by vodka, especially in the US. And so gin distillers pivoted to producing a lighter style of gin. This is considered a more contemporary style of gin, and Hendrick's is a good example of that lighter style of gin. So according to TTB, which regulates what you can and cannot put on labels in the US, gin has essentially 3 different subcategories. There's gin, which again, as I said, has to have the primary flavor coming from juniper. And then there is distilled gin, redistilled gin, and compounded gin. Distilled gin is when the gin maker distills their own wash, and the juniper and other botanicals are distilled along with it. Redistilled gin is when the gin producer buys neutral grain spirit or some other neutral spirit from another distiller and then redistills it themselves, again with the juniper and other botanicals added in. Compounded gin is actually when a neutral spirit, so essentially a vodka, is infused with the juniper and other botanicals. This is less common to find. So mostly in the US, we're seeing distilled gin and redistilled gin, and they don't actually put that on the label. So it's kind of like useless information that I'm giving you right now. But in the production of gin, when you are distilling or redistilling it, the juniper and botanicals can go inside of the actual liquid in the still, or I should say, it can be suspended where the vapors penetrate those botanicals. Now, interestingly, there are some brands such as Freeland Spirits who use other technologies. Freeland Spirits uses vacuum distillation as a part of their gin production. It's not the entire gin production, but it's a lot more delicate and it doesn't use a bunch of heat in order to distill the spirit. It uses a vacuum, so negative pressure relative to atmospheric pressure to create that boiling. There are also various liqueurs and cordials that you can make with gins. Sloe gin is a great example. I know we have a few brands in the US that make sloe gin, and that's taking a gin and then infusing it with sloe berries, which are from the blackthorn bush. So usually sugar is added to the sloe gins. There's also flavored gin, which is exactly what it sounds like, where you're adding flavors, whether they be naturally derived or not, to the gin. And usually it's in combination with sugar as well. But again, we have all these different styles of gins that are coming about that are not legally defined in the US. As I mentioned before, we have Old Tom Gin, which is a nod to the gin way back in the day that had more additives, a lot of robust flavor. They're not so crude in flavor anymore, and usually there's a little bit of sweetness that's added into it, so whether that be sugar or another type of sweetener. There are also London dry gins. This is a style that does not have to be produced in London, interestingly enough. And for London dry gins, they are made using fresh botanicals that are distilled with the spirit. There's nothing supposed to be added after distillation. However, according to the EU standards, London dry gin is allowed to have 0.1 grams of sugar per liter of alcohol added into it, which is very, very minute. We're also seeing more and more barrel-aged gin coming about. And this is also a nod to a style from the 17 and 1800s where gin was transported in barrels and stored in barrels rather than shipped around in bottles. So these barrel-aged gins are now having a little bit of oak influence into them. I think there are brands that are trying to produce similar gins to the Holland style of gin. However, Holland style gin is protected by a GI, so it has to be produced in certain regions in order to have the name Genever on the label. And and that's in, I believe, specific regions of Holland, Belgium, France, and Germany. Now, as I mentioned, gin and tonic is my go-to beverage when I'm out at a bar that's not a whiskey bar, or am at a wedding or something like that. And gin and tonics came about in India, in fact. This was due to British colonization of India. The British were getting malaria, and a cure for malaria was the quinine found in cinchona bark. It was very bitter, and in order to kind of mask the bitterness and balance it out, they created a tonic that they added to gin. So there you have it. I want to give a huge shout out to the Patreons. Thank you guys so much for helping to support the channel and for being a part of our neat community over on Patreon. If you would also like to support the channel beyond just thumbs up and comments and subscribing, I've got a link in the description below where you can join our neat community over on Patreon. I think gins are really cool because it's an opportunity for distillers to express their local botanicals in their gin, and a lot of them do. So there's various styles of gin out there. There are a variety of flavors, and I recommend that you go out and check them out. If you have a favorite gin, let me know in the comments below.